much for joining this innovation, productivity, and challenge in the digital era, Asia and beyond. Today, we are very grateful that Professor Sean Higgins will be here to present the paper. Why are firms slow to adopt profitable operations? And Jane Bai from JFK will be the discussions. And 25 minutes, please, Sean.
Thank you so much for having me. This paper is on why are small businesses slow to adopt profitable opportunities, in this joint work with Paul Gertler and Ulrike MALMENDIER from UC Berkeley and Waldo OJEDA from Baruch College. Our excellent research assistant, Cesar Landin, is also on the line. Keep your eyes out for his PhD applications this cycle. So the motivation for the paper is that firms are slow to adopt profitable opportunities. And this is true across many domains, including manufacturing, banking, retail, and healthcare. And it's also true across various types of opportunities, including cost-saving technologies, management practices, and optimal pricing. And firms are forgoing a substantial amount of profits by being slow to adopt these profitable opportunities. And that's true across the firm size distribution. So studies have found that small and medium enterprises in Brune, Carlin, and Shore forego 28% increase in productivity by not adopting a profitable opportunity. Medium and large firms in Bloom et al. Were foregoing a 17% increase in productivity, and large retail chains in Delavigne and Genskow were foregoing a $16 million in annual profits, which is about 2% of their revenue, and of course, a higher fraction of their profits. So the question that we're asking in this paper is why? Why are firms slow to adopt these profitable opportunities? And the literature has pointed to several things that may be contributing, including lack of information, fixed costs combined with credit constraints or with uncertainty, or misaligned incentives within the firm, where the person within the firm making the decision about whether to adopt is not the same as the person who has the profit maximizing incentives of the firm in mind. But even when these standard economic frictions are removed, firms are still slow to adopt these profitable opportunities. So there's a quote in the Bloom et al. Paper where they find that the main constraint is going to be lack of information, but they find that even once the owners became convinced of the need to adopt a practice, even after that constraint is removed and the owners want to adopt the practice, they often still take several months to do so. In the Delavigne and Genskow paper, they talk a lot about managerial inertia as a constraint. And then in the Mishra, Prabhala, and Rajan paper, they talk about stickiness in organizational structures and practices. But these last two explanations are a bit unsatisfactory in the sense that you want to ask the follow-up question, well, why is it that firms exhibit inertia in organizational practices, even though these behaviors reduce their profits? And even in the absence of the standard economic frictions like informational frictions, fixed costs, or misaligned incentives. So the method that we're going to use in this paper to answer that research question is a randomized controlled trial in Mexico, where we're going to test three potential explanations going beyond those standard economic frictions. And those are going to be limited memory, present bias, and a lack of trust in other firms. And we're also going to allow for potentially distorted beliefs about memory and present bias. What we're going to do in the RCT is offer a lower merchant fee to about 34,000 firms that are already using the fintech payments technology. And for the median firm, the expected reduction in the fee, the cost savings from this lower fee, is equal to about 3% of their profits. So if you're trying to think about, is 3% of profits large or small, the way that we thought about it going into the experiment was think about 3% of your income, figure out what that dollar amount is, and decide whether you would take a 1-minute action in order to see that increase in your income. What we're going to randomize in the RCT is the value of the offer, how much we offer to reduce the merchant fee, whether the fintech sets a deadline to accept the offer, whether the fintech sends them a reminder about the offer, and whether the fintech company says in advance that it will send them a reminder, which is going to be what I'll call the anticipated reminder. And this RCT design is motivated by an augmented version of a model by Keith Erickson, where his model is trying to explain how present bias and limited memory interact to affect task completion. And then based on some of the findings in the paper that can't be explained by the Erickson model that we went into the RCT with, we're going to augment the model to include trust. So to give you a sense of what our treatments look like, here on the left, you see an example of the no reminder, no deadline email, or equivalently the unanticipated reminder, no deadline email, because the groups that have no reminder or the unanticipated reminder are going to receive the same initial email. So you can see here, we're telling them in large letters at the top what their new lower fee will be, that this is an offer to lower their merchant fee. And then they have a button to click in the form that they have to click the button and fill a short form in order to activate their lower merchant fee. We tell them here that the offer will only take 1 minute to complete. And the idea there was to give them a sense of how costly in terms of time cost it would be to complete this offer. Now on the right, we have the anticipated reminder deadline arm. And so here we are telling them about the deadline first, so that you can see in bold red letters, they have to fill the form by October 6th. And then the anticipated reminder tells them that they'll receive a reminder on October 5th. And we sent these initial emails on September 29th. So that's about 7 and 8 days later that the anticipated reminder and deadline happen. And we also have, I'm not showing it here, but we have interactions between the different treatment arms. So you could be in the anticipated reminder, no deadline group, or deadline, but unanticipated or no reminder. So to give you a preview of the findings, we find that reminders increase take-up of the lower merchant fee by 18%, which is evidence that firms are forgetful. We find that deadlines do not increase take-up of the offer, which is evidence that present bias does not explain non-adoption in this context. We find that anticipated reminders do not reduce initial take-up, which is evidence of overconfidence about memory in the model, and I'll explain that in a bit when I go through the model. And then we find that anticipated reminders increase final take-up, meaning take-up after they get the reminder, by more than unanticipated reminders. So if you compare the two groups that both got a reminder, the ones who knew in advance they were going to get the reminder have a larger increase in take-up from getting the reminder. That's an additional 7% increase in take-up. Now, this is a result that cannot be predicted by the Erickson model that we designed the RCT around. So then we came up with some hypotheses. What could be explaining it? We conducted a follow-up survey with a subsample of our sample to test those hypotheses. And we find evidence that the anticipated reminders change the firm's perceptions of the offer's value. And in particular, this operates through trust. So the effect of the anticipated reminder is concentrated among firms with low general trust. So to go through the model, we use an augmented version of Keith Erickson's model to fix ideas about present bias, limited memory, and lack of trust. The model is going to allow for biased beliefs, so naivete about present bias, which is standard, and then we're also going to have potentially overconfidence about memory. Present bias is going to take the standard beta delta form, and we're going to say we're going to also have beliefs about present bias that can vary from actual present bias, and we're going to call people naive if their beta hat is greater than their beta. Then we're going to model memory as the probability of remembering the offer at time t, conditional on remembering it at time t minus 1. I'm going to call that rho t. And there are going to be beliefs about memory, rho hat, which can differ from actual memory. And we're going to say that they're overconfident about memory if rho hat is greater than rho. And then we're also going to add the probability the firm assigns to the offer being true, which I'm going to call alpha t, and that can change over time. We're going to assume that the cost, there's a cost draw each period drawn from a known distribution, and then the agent is going to decide whether to act in each period based on their current value function. So if they act, they get the benefit with a 1-period delay, so that's discounted by beta delta. They have some probability that they think the offer is actually true and they get the benefit, so that's the alpha here, and then they're going to pay a cost C today to act. So that's the value function if they act. If they don't act, they don't get a value of 0, they get some continuation value because there's some expectations they have over whether they'll adopt and get those benefits in the future. And so here you can see that they are only going to be able to adopt if they remember. That's the row. It's in the future, so they're discounting by beta delta, and then they have some expectation over their continuation value, where the expectations denote expectations over future cost draws. And then the hat here on the V denotes that that's going to be where VT here is a function of real betas because it's based on what's going on today. The V hat is going to be a function of beta hats because your expectations today are going to be based on your beta hat, your potentially biased beliefs about your present bias that will happen in the future rather than your actual present bias. There's going to be a deadline in period T, and then by backwards induction from the deadline, there's going to be a threshold where you adopt if your cost draw is below the threshold. That threshold is going to be defined recursively by a set of equations where this is a recursive set of equations because the continuation value here is also a function of the C star. Then we're going to get a probability of adopting at period T. That's going to be a function of the probability you remember in period T multiplied by the probability you haven't already adopted before period T multiplied by the probability that it is optimal for you to adopt in period T, conditional on remembering and not having adopted already. We're still working on estimating a structural model, but in the structural model, these are going to be the moments. So for every treatment arm, we're going to have in each period a probability or a fraction who adopt. So the predictions that we get out of the model are the first one's obvious. A higher value of the offer or a higher benefit is going to increase take-up. The second prediction is that reminders will increase take-up of the offer if firms are forgetful, so if their row is less than 1. Deadlines will increase take-up if firms are present biased, beta less than 1. And one of the main points of the Erickson model is that this increase is going to partly occur at time 1 on the first day, rather than at the time of the deadline, if firms are partially aware of their limited memory. At least partially aware of their limited memory. Then we have two sets of predictions around anticipated reminders. The first one is about what effect the anticipated reminder has on pre-reminder take-up when you get that initial email. And that prediction is that anticipated reminders are going to decrease take-up on day 1 compared to an unanticipated reminder if firms are forgetful and have accurate beliefs about their memory. So the idea here is that some firms find it optimal to wait, even if they're not present bias. If they had perfect memory, they would prefer to wait because they got a bad cost draw today and they have expectations that they'll get a better cost draw in the future. But if they are forgetful and they know they're forgetful, that's going to push some of those firms to adopt on day 1, even if they would otherwise, if they had perfect memory, prefer to wait. Now imagine you give an anticipated reminder to those firms. Now they don't have to worry about forgetting again. They can say, okay, great. I would have wanted to wait if I had perfect memory. I don't have perfect memory, but I know I'm going to get a reminder. So that pushes them to not adopt on day 1 and prefer to wait. So that's that first prediction. The anticipated reminders will have no effect on pre-reminder take-up on day 1 if firms are fully overconfident about their memory. So the idea there is that if you think you'll remember, then you don't care whether I'm going to send you a reminder or not. You're not worried about forgetting. And then anticipated reminders, we also have a prediction on their effect on post-reminder take-up, which is that they will not affect take-up compared to the unanticipated reminder if firms inherently trust the offer. So if alpha equals 1, but anticipated reminders can increase post-reminder take-up compared to the anticipated reminder if some firms distrust the offer and if the anticipated reminder increases their trust in the offer, which we're going to show evidence that it does. So let me give you a few more details about the experimental setting. Our research partner is a fintech payments company that wanted to offer a lower merchant fee in order to measure elasticities. So they had no idea if they were charging the optimal merchant fee. That's why they partnered with us for this experiment. The firms in the sample were already users of the fintech company's point of sale terminal hardware and app. What is the merchant fee? It's a % of the sale that the firm pays to accept card payments. And prior to our experiment, firms paid either a 3.5% or 3.75% merchant fee. in the experiment, we're going to offer them a lower merchant fee of either 2.75% or 3%, which of those two they get offered by the fintech company is going to be randomly determined so that we have some exogenous variation in the value of the offer. The logistics are that the messages were sent by the fintech company via email and SMS. There was an online form to accept the lower fee that takes about a minute to complete. And the owner of the firm, you may be worried, well, maybe the emails weren't getting to the owner of the firm. We were worried about that too, so we asked about it in the survey, and it turns out that the owner of the firm was the recipient of the email for about 88% of the sample. The sample was made up of 34,000 firms that were the top quartile of the fintech company's users. So the fintech company has about 4 times this many users. We restricted it to their top quartile, which were 34,000 users, to ensure that the offer would be sufficiently valuable. Our main outcome is going to be take up from the administrative data. And then we're also going to survey a small subsample of firms. We were highly constrained here by restrictions imposed by our research partner. So we were only able to do 430 surveys, and those are going to be to explore mechanisms. This is an example of what one of the firms looks like. This is a coffee shop in Mexico City. You can see what the technology looks like. And I also want you to have in mind that these are small firms. So the bulk of the mass is between 2 and 5 employees. The mean number of employees is 3.5 and the median is 3. Here are some other characteristics about the firms. You can see that 44% of them are owned by women. Average owner age is 39, and they're spread across a variety of industries, small retailers, restaurants, professionals, which would be, for example, a small doctor's office. And we're also going to exploit heterogeneity in this variable, which is how many months have they been using the technology? How many months have they been using this particular fintech payments platform? The experimental timeline was that on day 1, we sent out the initial email. The no deadline, no reminder group just gets that offer, and then nothing else happens. The anticipated reminder group gets that offer with that sentence about the future reminder, and then they receive that future reminder on day 7. The unanticipated reminder group receives the initial email that's identical to the no reminder group, but then they do get a reminder on day 7, and that reminder email is identical to the anticipated reminder group's reminder. And then the deadline group receives the offer and is told about the deadline, and then they have a deadline on day 8. And I'm not showing it here, but we also have interactions between those different treatment arms. So let me get into the results. Before I get into the more non-standard economic frictions, incentives do matter.
A quick clarification question.
Sure.
How would you ascertain that those people who will receive a reminder anticipate the reminder? Maybe they forget.
Yeah, so we're just calling it anticipated because we tell them in the initial email that we're going to send them a reminder. Now some of them might not see that sentence, some of them might see it, but forget about it. That would just dampen our treatment effects of the anticipated reminder.
Thank you.
So here, incentives do matter. We had exogenous variation in how valuable the offer was. A 2.75% offer is more valuable than a 3% offer. And so here you can see that the take-up is higher for the more valuable offer by about 3 percentage points. Reminders have an even larger effect on take-up than that difference in the incentives. So the reminder increases take-up by 5 percentage points. Here in these graphs, I'm always going to be showing you raw take-up levels for 2 groups in the left graph, and then treatment effects with 95% confidence intervals on the right graph. So what you can see here is that as expected, there's no difference in take-up prior to the reminder between the reminder and no reminder groups. But then once we send the reminder, you see this 5 percentage point treatment effect of the reminder on take-up. Deadlines, on the other hand, do not increase take-up. They do actually decrease take-up on day 1 by about 1 percentage point, but then take-up in the deadline group catches up to take-up in the no deadline group by the deadline. Now, you might say, well, on day 8, there's a positive point estimate. Maybe there is an effect of the deadline, and these firms are present biased. You just don't have enough power to detect that. But if it were really present bias driving any potential deadline effect, what we would expect is that gap would remain over time because the present biased firms would just continue procrastinating every day, even after the deadline, and they would never end up adopting. Whereas if this were potential effect of the deadline were driven by something rational, like the firms in the no deadline group don't have a deadline, so they're just waiting for a better cost draw, and they haven't happened to have a better cost draw or a day they're less busy before the deadline, but they will at some point after the deadline. You'd expect take up in the no deadline group to catch up to take up in the deadline group. And that's exactly what we see. It only takes about 3 days for take up in the no deadline group to catch up to take up in the deadline group after the deadline, and then take up in the no deadline group surpasses take up in the deadline group after the deadline. On anticipated reminders, we find that they don't reduce take up on day one, which in the model, for the reasons I explained when going through the model, is evidence of overconfidence about memory. Is there a question?
Yeah, a quick one. Do you also see some firms, they just pass deadline but still try to register, i.e. they indeed, when they got their first email, they didn't wrote down the deadline on their calendar, and they just the wrong deadline, or just pass the deadline, they suddenly realize, oh, I should register for this, even without a reminder.
That's a good question. I would have to, we would have to check with the research partner. They didn't let them activate the lower fee after the deadline, but I'm not sure if we have data on whether they tried to enter into the page and activate the lower fee. That's a good thing to check with them. So the second effect of anticipated reminders that we see is that there is this effect once they get the reminder. And actually, if you pool all the pre-reminder days and compare them to the post-reminder days, the difference between those two is actually statistically significant. So if you look day by day, just say day 6 versus day 7, as you can see here, the difference is not significant between those two. There is clearly a statistically significant effect after the deadline. But if you want to compare it to a potential effect before the deadline, if you pool the pre-reminder and post-reminder days, there is a statistically significant effect, statistically significantly higher effect after the reminder than before the reminder of the anticipated reminder. So in the last few minutes, I want to dig into the mechanisms behind that anticipated reminder effect, because again, this was something that is not predicted by the Erickson model that we specified before doing the RCT and that we designed the RCT around. So we conducted a survey with a sample of firms. And the question where you really see a big difference between the anticipated reminder arm and the unanticipated reminder arm in the survey is the question, did the reminder change your perception of the offer's value? So here you can see that a much higher fraction of firms in the anticipated reminder arm said, yes, receiving the reminder changed my perception of the offer's value. Now, that's not necessarily trust, but you can see the way we modeled trust, how it could be trust if you think about the perceived offer value as the probability the offer is true times the benefit conditional on being true. Our more direct evidence on trust comes from a couple of other tests. First, we included a bunch of general social survey measures in the survey where we try to measure things like whether these firms have general trust, whether they trust advertised offers, reciprocity, procrastination, memory, etc. We ask them to agree with those statements on a 1 to 5 scale, and then we code whether they agree or disagree. And then we do heterogeneous treatment effects based on whether they have high or low levels of those various survey measures. And so what you can see here is that the effect of the anticipated reminder, the treatment effect of the anticipated reminder, is entirely concentrated among low trust firms, firms with low general trust. Whereas for firms with high general trust, there's no treatment effect of the anticipated reminder relative to the unanticipated reminder. And then you can see that for all of the other survey measures that we have, there's no statistically significant difference. There's no statistically significant heterogeneous treatment effect for those other survey measures. Somewhat of a validating exercise for this type of analysis is that if you then do the same analysis but compare unanticipated reminders to no reminder, you see that the effect is concentrated among low memory firms. So we think this does tell us that we're actually picking something up with this type of test. And it also tests whether you might think the reminder itself could also affect trust, independent of the anticipated reminder. But here we're seeing no heterogeneous treatment effect of the unanticipated reminder relative to no reminder on trust.
Sean, 2 more minutes, please.
Great, perfect. So the last results slide that I want to show you is a final set of results on trust, which is, I was just showing you results from the survey. Now we can go back to the admin data. In the admin data, we don't measure trust directly. We only have that in the survey sample. But in the admin data, we do have this measure of how long have you been using the technology, which we expect to be correlated with whether you trust, not whether you have high general trust, but whether you have high trust in this particular other firm with which you have firm-to-firm interactions, because you've been using their technology for a long time. And so what we see there is that for firms that have been using the technology for longer, we see no treatment effect, which is the difference between these the blue line and the red line, but we do see higher overall levels of take up among those firms that have been using the technology for longer. Whereas if we look at firms who have been using the technology for less than the median amount of time, that's where we see the treatment effect of the anticipated reminder relative to the unanticipated reminder concentrated. So to conclude, we find that forgetfulness, overconfidence about memory, and a lack of trust can prevent firms from adopting profitable opportunities. I didn't include it in today's presentation due to time, but we also measure whether firms were elastic to this lower fee, which is why the fintech company was partnering with us in the first place. And we find that there is an elasticity of card sales with respect to the fee of about -2. So they have about a 20% reduction in the fee on average, but they increase their sales by their card sales by about 40% on average. So in the end, it was profitable for the fintech partner to offer this lower merchant fee. And broadly, we think that this tells us that the analysis of constraints to firms' adoption of profitable opportunities would benefit from considering mechanisms beyond the standard economic frictions. We're not saying that the standard economic frictions don't matter, but we're saying that even when you shut those down, there are additional frictions that prevent adoption of profitable opportunities. And we also want to make the point that there are well-known behavioral determinants of individuals failing to act, and that these behavioral determinants can also affect firms and prevent them from adopting profitable opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now let's welcome Jay Bai from JFK, Harvard. Thanks for helping us. Your turn, please.
Thank you. Let me share my slide. Great. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to discuss this paper. I have very much enjoyed reading the paper. So let me start with a summary. The paper goes after a very important question, which is why are firms slow to adopt profitable opportunities? So the literature sometimes refer to this as managerial inertia or stickiness in organizational structure and practices. But really the important question is to understand the underlying factors behind this observed inertia and or stickiness that prevent firms from adopting profitable opportunities. I think there's also the evidence still growing in this topic, but it seems to be these problems are more severe in developing countries, firms in developing countries. I think understanding why, what are the underlying factors would help us to think about potential remedies, and that will speak to policy implications. So this paper, Shing and co-authors, they explore 3 behavioral channels behind the potential lack of adoption, namely present bias, limited memory, and lack of trust. So I would say the first 2 have been documented pretty very extensively in the, at individual level, like individuals, when they make decisions, they face these behavioral issues, but not much in the firm's setting. So I think this is adding to the growing literature about behavioral firms, and especially thinking about how these behavioral issues impact firms' optimal decision-making. And the authors add a 3rd channel, which is relatively underexplored in the firm literature, which is lack of trust. So, and importantly, these 3 channels, they may potentially interact with each other. So for example, if we think about remedies, against the first two behavioral channels, right? Present bias and limited memories. The traditional remedies such as providing deadlines, giving reminders, these remedies may not function very well if the recipient have limited trust of the party who sends out the offer. So in theory, these channels could interact with each other. And the paper designs an experiment that nicely tries to test these potential underlying channels and the interactions between them. So the authors partner with a fintech payment provider in Mexico. And the sample consists of almost 34,000 existing clients who are active users of the payment technology of the fintech firm. So what is the opportunity, the profitable opportunity here? It is a lower merchant fee for each payment that these firms receive from their customers. And there are two levels of this reduced fee amount. And it's a profitable opportunity precisely because the cost, the registration cost of getting these opportunities seems to be very minimal. It requires one click and filling up a very short registration form. So we would think that firms would have the, rational firms would have the incentive to adopt this opportunity. I think the first and foremost, most striking finding that I find in the paper that I think the authors can highlight more is that adoption is far from being perfect. I will go to the result shortly, but it's like only 30% on average, 30 or lower than 30% of the firms adopted even the lowest fee level treatment. So that sets up the puzzle. So why is this seems to be a very profitable opportunity? Why is adoption so low? Now, to shed light on the potential barriers, speaking to the three channels, the authors experimentally vary the feature of this offer, whether to give deadlines, whether to give out reminders, and they also further vary the design of these reminders and deadlines to try to tease apart these different underlying barriers. I will talk about this more when I review the results and give out comments in detail in the next slide. But just to finish the summary, basically, the authors then interpret all the experimental findings through a theoretical model, which is built on an existing model from a previous paper by X in 2017, and they augment the model by adding a trust component to it. So the idea is, through the theory, what do we expect to see with and without deadlines if firms are present biased? And hence, can we, based on what we actually see between the deadline, no deadline group, can we then falsify the hypothesis that firms are present biased or not? So that's the logic. So I really very much like the fact that they use a theoretically guided model to generate predictions and to organize, use that to basically to interpret the experimental findings. So here are my main comments. So there are a lot to like about this paper. So first of all, I think the empirical setting is very rich. It has a very well designed, executed RCT. And not only that, the authors also have a lot of very rich admin data, plus a small subsample firm survey that could provide qualitative evidence to shed light on some of the experimental findings. And secondly, the experiment is very well executed, and this is very impressive, given that this happened during the peak of the pandemic with such a large number of firms, and so I find it very impressive. And thirdly, the interpretation of the results is guided by a theoretical framework, and that was also very helpful. I think the authors mentioned in the paper that there's a structural estimation that's forthcoming. So I think the combination of these different ingredients really make this a very powerful paper to help us to understand, especially for small businesses in developing countries, how important are these behavioral barriers against adoption of profitable technologies. So I have three main comments and suggestions. The first is really to try to understand the context and the sample better in order to think about potentially generalizability of the result. And I think the authors have a lot of data and many other potential direction that they can explore the data further. And I'll give some concrete suggestions. And the second is to think of ways to further improve the streamlining and also highlighting the main takeaways of the experimental findings. And the third is, so I'm very curious about this trust channel. And I would like to push the authors to think more about a potential micro foundation to understand the trust channel. So let me start with the first in terms of understanding the context, or specifically about this sample of firms better. So this sample, to summarize, these are relatively large and active clients of the fintech firm. So they're selected from the top quartile in terms of the average monthly sales. So my prior would be that, if there's anything trust issue would be less binding for these existing clients, large existing clients of the firm, compared to relatively smaller or new client of the firm. So in some sense, maybe we can use this to argue that in other contexts, trust issue would be more severe. And that said, even among these relatively large active clients, there is actually quite a lot of heterogeneity among these top users. So in terms of, this is from one of the appendix figures, in terms of the percentage of sales they made through the fintech provider. So there's quite a lot of variation even among the top users. So I think when we think about what is really the value of this offer, it very much depends on the firm. It depends on both the absolute amount of transaction through the provider, but also the percentage of transaction that the firm makes through the provider. You can imagine a large firm, but only at baseline, only a small fraction of the transactions go through the hardware, the technology. Then this offer would not be super attractive to the firm. So I think the author seems to have all the baseline information. So I would first check the correlation between the absolute amount of transaction and the percentage of transactions at the firm level, and use that information to then define which firms would really value this offer, in which they're really relying on this on the provider for a large fraction of their transactions. And I would then explore heterogeneity along this dimension. So that's one thing. Relatedly, I'll talk about this point first. It seems that firms also have heterogeneous beliefs or understanding about their current rate, their current fee that they need to pay to the provider. And therefore, when we think about, again, the value of the offer, is really the difference between the new offer rate, which is randomized, and the firm's current perceived rate, right? So I think this perception, if I understand correctly, this perception is not observed for the full sample, but in which case we can define the difference or the value of the, how attractive this new offer is by the difference between the new offer rate and the current rate the firm is currently getting. So I think that may help to strengthen power for some of the experimental, the reduced form analysis. Now, my last point regarding the understanding the sample better is that I think there's, again, a lot of information in the baseline administrative data. So for example, the authors mentioned in the paper that at baseline, there are actually two types of rate regimes. There's a fixed rate and a sliding scale. So I will not go into this in detail, but I think my point here is that you seem to be able to identify firms just using the baseline data prior to the intervention. You seem to be able to identify firms who actually make suboptimal decisions at baseline. For example, it's actually better, given my sales volume, it's better for me to opt into the fixed rate schedule rather than the sliding scale, but I'm doing the other way. And you can also identify to what extent firms make the wrong decision. I'll be curious to know like who these firms are, if they make suboptimal decisions at baseline in terms of their age, size, their sector, or any other observable characteristics. And then more interestingly, we can then, with the intervention, you can then see whether these firms who are more prone to mistakes at baseline, are they also less or more responsive to the various remedies offered under the treatment, for example, deadlines, reminders, do they behave differently from those firms who make better decisions at baseline? So I think that's something very interesting to see. It will tell us, I think that will tell us like these behavioral responses that we see under the intervention is something like more like an inherent persistent feature of the firm. And we can learn more about who these firms are using the baseline administrative data. Okay, how much time do I have? Okay. Okay, let me move to the second point in terms of organizing the experimental findings. I think the great aspect of this paper is that it has a lot of treatment arms, which offers opportunities to look at many different potential interaction effects of these different remedies. But I think at the same time, it poses a challenge in terms of how do we then organize the results and how do we dissect the different subgroups. So Shang didn't mention this fully in the presentation, but they actually have 14 2x2, 15 treatment arms, including one control. And these are fully interacted, 2 offer levels, 2 deadline groups, 3 reminder groups, including the no reminder group, in total 3. And plus there are 2 additional deadline groups without reminder at different rate level. It's a 1-day deadline as opposed to the 8-day deadline group. So I think one challenge I had is, how do we then think about comparing these different cross-randomized arms and take a step back. What is the rationale for creating this specific cross-randomization? For example, would theory predict that some of these interaction groups will have a different impact than the other interaction group? Or should we just focus on several levels of interaction rather than the fully interacted, all these fully interacted arms? I think more clarity there would be very useful. So I will suggest one way to reorganize the results, which is mainly reflecting my current takeaway at this point. I think first it would be useful to just show that the overall take-up rate of the offers is far from being perfect. And to show that, I think the author can just focus on the groups without any remedy. So this is a no reminder, no deadline, and just showing an equivalent figure of like this, but for those groups without any remedy, and show that even with such an profitable opportunity, take-up is far from being perfect. And again, they can look at heterogeneity across firms based on what I discussed before, based on the how important this offer is given the firm's baseline sales volumes through the provider. And also based on whether these firms are making suboptimal decisions already at baseline. So that's the first key takeaway for me. The second is, this is also very clear, which is that deadlines does not increase take-up rate. So for this, I think it would be nice to just focus on the deadline only groups without reminders. So just compare the outcomes between no deadline, 1-day deadline, and 8-day deadline, and show that overall deadlines does not increase overall take-up. And again, I think the authors can explore heterogeneity in terms of the actual attractiveness of the offer to the particular recipient. We may think that these behavioral issues may be less binding when the opportunity becomes more attractive given the firm's baseline status. Okay. Okay, so the third, this reminder effect. So the third takeaway is that reminders does significantly increase take-up, and the effect seems to persist in the longer term. So again, I think here will be useful to, again, just focus on the reminder only groups and show 3 lines: no reminder, unanticipated reminder, and anticipated reminder. And this is very convincing that there's a clear jump in take-up rate when the reminder is sent. Now let me zoom into the last part of the paper, which is the reduced form part, which is the comparison between the 2 different groups of reminders, the anticipated reminder and the unanticipated reminder. So this is the key figure. The authors make 2 takeaways from this figure. The first is there isn't a negative effect of the anticipated reminder on day 1. Okay, and the second takeaway is that there is a jump after the posted reminder, after the reminder is actually sent. So let me talk about the first one first. So their interpretation of this no negative effect of anticipated reminder relative to non-anticipated reminder is that firms are overconfident about their memory. So I think 2 suggestions. This would be more, this story would be more salient for the deadline groups compared to the no deadline groups. So maybe it's useful to dissect the samples in that way to compare this for the deadline group and the no deadline group and see if you find any initial difference. And also, I think this is also one of the questions one of the panelists mentioned. It could be that the lack of the initial effect could be that firms did not pay attention to this information about the future reminder in the original email. So I don't know whether you can provide any survey evidence to rule this out or to support this. And do you also observe any heterogeneity by the amount of the time firms actually spent reading the email offer? It seems like you may have some information if it was sent through some centralized system. Okay, now let me move to the last part, which is the jump. So I think the author's takeaway here is that there is higher post-reminder take-up among the anticipated group compared to the unanticipated group. And the interpretation is that there is an increase in trust upon receiving the anticipated reminder. Now, I think just looking at this graph, the difference seems to start to increase actually before the reminder kicks in. It's not day 5, day 6. It's not statistically different, but there seems to be an increasing trend. Also, just looking at the raw data, it seems that the unanticipated reminder group always lies above the unanticipated reminder group, and there's some evidence that this gap is enlarging. So it makes me feel that because since this is the key fact to establish the trust story, so I would nudge the authors to explore more robustness. For example, for this jump, is that robust across different deadline groups and offer level groups? Is it robust across different sectors of the firms? So I also think that this jump, this increase in trust story is quite nuanced because it requires firms to be, somewhat skeptical when they receive the initial order, right, or offer, but yet they need to pay attention to the details of the offer such that they remember about seeing this reminder, and they still remember, when the reminder is finally sent, they will recall that they actually read about this reminder, this reminder in the initial offer. So it's a quite nuanced story. So again, if there's any information that the authors can explore in terms of the length of the time that they spend reading the offer email, that might be also help to provide more power and to support the interpretation. So I just finished my last comment regarding this trust channel is that, I think the survey evidence is very nice. The post-survey evidence that it seems to be about mistrust about who actually sent the offer rather than whether the offer is genuine offer. So from the company. So it's actually some, skepticism about whether this offer is actually from the fintech firm or from someone like someone else, a potential scam.
Jay, you actually have 3 minutes. You may not have to rush.
After.
Yeah,
Okay.
you have 3 more minutes.
Okay,
are you okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, so I think what I would love to see here is a discussion of the potential micro foundation of the trust channel. Like conceptually, why do we think that receiving an anticipated reminder would actually boost trust level? What is the underlying, potential theory? So I'm not suggesting that you should write down like a fuller Bayesian game, but you could imagine even just describing a theory qualitatively would be helpful here. For example, we can imagine potentially a signaling model in which you have different types of sellers, and in equilibrium, only the honest type would choose to send an anticipated reminder and then fulfill the reminder, right? Why is that? Maybe because different sellers have different cost, right? Or the returns of actually fulfilling a reminder. That will generate that. So that will make this anticipated reminder a credible signal for honest type. So that will then rationalize why firms would perceive that as a useful signal and then increase their trust to the offer. So I think again, not like trying to write down a full-fledged Bayesian game model, but some discussions about why firms would think in this way, I think will be very helpful. Again, that understanding this really the underlying thinking behind this will also help us to generalize the finding to other contexts in terms of how do we design these reminder systems to increase take-up. Okay, I'll conclude. So I think definitely the paper goes after an important question, and it has very rich empirical context and a very well executed experiment. Now, I think areas to improve, for example, further streamlining the results to focus on the main takeaways. So I think there are a lot of promising directions the authors can explore the data further, including the baseline administrative data and more heterogeneity with respect to the potential value of the offer. And finally, also tighten the link between theory and empirics. And there are two aspects. First of all, I think it would be useful to use the model to motivate why are we having all of the different cross-randomization arms, and how do we think about all the potential interaction effects across all these arms. And finally, it's using a theory to provide a micro foundation to understand the trust channel deeper. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Jai. Baiji, thank you very much. You all observe time very well. Thank you very much. Let me, Sean, may I just collect a few more comments before you respond? Would that be good?
Yes, perfect. Thank
you. Any questions, any comments? Michael?
Yeah. So I would like to follow up on Jay's comments. Basically, I want to ask, I want to understand better the generalizability of the paper. The trust, the result on trust is very, very interesting. But what is exactly the micro foundation of trust? If you think about in old days, you see a machine, you buy a machine, then you see, the price and the benefit, everything is transparent. But in this case, I would like to know, how likely these users or these firms would like to kind of relate this to, say, scam, as Jay just mentioned, or potentially fraud, or more generally speaking, they are pretty unsure about how many strings are actually attached to this offer. So maybe, you accept this offer, then there's some other conditions the fintech company would like to ask you to follow, to adopt. So so in this specific case, I think these users are not quite sure about the downsides or the potential costs of adopting this technology. And then, related to your finding, the anticipated reminder and how, it works, and maybe it is possible for us to think about it as a device to distinguish, those fraud scam versus, this genuine offer. or there's any other things kind of related to this kind of a more general question, how costly this technological adoption will be. And also the last thing is the last figure is very interesting. The new commerce are kind of more skeptical of taking up this this offer, but that itself maybe newcomers themselves potentially more skeptical of new technology. That's why they are newcomers. They didn't really adopt this fintech in the first place. So yeah, probably just some of my random thoughts. Once again, this is a very interesting paper. I just want to know more what's happening behind the trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. May I take up one more from Bushran?
Yeah, maybe I can raise. Oh, can I?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, yeah, indeed. When I was making notes, then I realized actually Jay has covered some of my questions. But I think I probably want to push one thing further. That is, maybe in your next survey, can you like specifically in the email writing up like, if you take this offer, how much estimated, cost you may save, right? So rather than seeing like a 3% to 2.75%, and now they say exact number based on their transaction last month will actually make them take up the offer as soon as possible. And also, I think now actually is a little bit following Jay's comment, but I want to push it further. That's can you survey those takers whether they decide to take an offer after reminder is because they recall the reminder, or it's because they recall they have been told that they will be reminded, right? If there's a second, then actually that's more consistent with the trust, or even like the trust mechanism you proposed, rather than just the first. Oh, now I realize. I remember the reminder. That would be my thought.
I'm going to add one very simple question before I turn back to you, Sean. I wonder if there's any, Jie mentioned a lot about the nuance that we can explore. I wonder if there's anything, or maybe I missed it, you may have explored the geographic differences across your correspondence. I suspect that just the background of the location may have a lot to do with the behavior. Well, I think maybe Yi, do you have any question? Maybe it's a good time to ask Chan to respond to Jie and also our three comments. You have to. Oh, Yi, do you want to say something too?
I'm good. I just listened to all the questions.
Okay, so I'll ask you to do it in the second round. Sean, please.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jia, for the excellent discussion. We'll definitely be able to implement a lot of that, and it's super helpful to get your thoughts on the. Actually, I'll share my screen so I can show a couple things that we have. So the first thing Jia mentioned, the something that I didn't mention in the presentation, so I just wanted to show everyone that since Jia mentioned it, that we did this at the peak of the pandemic. So actually we were originally going to do it in March 2020. We had a launch date of March 24th, 2020, leading up to the experiment. Of course, we couldn't do it in March 2020, but basically what we agreed with the fintech company was that, well, we saw this huge drop off in sales as companies closed down during the pandemic. We agreed with them that we'd keep monitoring sales over time. And once sales had recovered to pre-pandemic levels, that's when we would launch the experiment, because then we knew these businesses were back open, they were back doing business. And then at that point in time, we redefined the sample. So if there were any businesses that had essentially dropped out of the top quartile of users because they had started using it less or shut down during the pandemic, then they were out of our sample. So we redefined that top quartile. And then that heterogeneity in the fraction of their sales that they do through the technology, I think, yeah, we can definitely exploit it with the caveat that we only have it for the survey subsample. but we should definitely do that. On that, I wanted to mention that our 3% of profits that I cited in the paper, so that's already taking into account that a lot of these firms are not transacting a small, or on average, or the median is about 20% of their total sales are going through the technology. When we do those calculations of profits, how profitable is this to adopt? That 3% is already taking into account this, just the transactions that are going through the technology, but taking into account their overall profits that we ask about in the survey. So that's another measure we could potentially use heterogeneity on that we haven't done yet. And then on the heterogeneity by the value of the offer. So on that, we have done it. I don't actually have it. So G mentioned like heterogeneity by kind of what really matters for how valuable the offer is going to be how basically a multiplication between how much your sales are going through the technology by that reduction, by that delta you get from the lower offer. And I don't have that one here, but I have, for example, I have the two components of it. So I have what are your baseline sales and what was the value of the offer. And so if we look at it, for example, for the effect of the reminder, heterogeneity by baseline sales, you actually don't see any heterogeneous treatment effect of the reminder by baseline sales. So you see just as much of a reminder effect for those firms with more sales versus less sales. And then if you do it by value of the reminder, where here we're just using the exogenous part, 2.75 versus 3, you also see no heterogeneous treatment effect. So we think that lack of a heterogeneous treatment effect is also interesting. And then we've also done the one Gia asked for, but I don't have it here, where we combine the two. But as you can see from these two pieces of it, you wouldn't expect, and we don't see heterogeneous treatment effects there. Where we do see some interesting, potentially interesting ones is when, so Gia also talked about the deadline. Does the deadline effect matter based on the value of the offer, and some theoretical reasons that it might? And so there we do have some interesting heterogeneity. The first thing is that this day one effect is concentrated among the more valuable offer, this kind of negative day one effect of the deadline. Then by the deadline, you actually see an effect of the deadline only for the less valuable offer. And at first we thought, oh, this is a big important result that we'll highlight more in the paper. But we actually backed away from that because for the same reason that kind of positive point estimate, we don't think that's not a present bias driven effect of the deadline, but rather an effect of these firms potentially rationally saying, oh, I've been busy all week, but I'm going to get a day that I'm less busy next week, so let me wait. And so the reason that we didn't push this heterogeneous treatment effect too much is that for both the more valuable and less valuable offer, take up in the no deadline group does catch up and surpass take up in the deadline group. So in the more valuable offer, you see that happen right away. At the deadline, there's already no treatment effect. In the less valuable offer, you did see that treatment effect of the deadline by the deadline, and then it takes a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, for the take up in the no deadline group to catch up. But I'd be curious, and maybe we can also chat more later about it offline to dig in a little more on that comment of how kind of theoretically the deadline may have these differential effects and what these results tell us there. And then on the anticipated reminder, you also mentioned potentially heterogeneous treatment effects of the anticipated reminder by whether there's a deadline or not. As far as the overall effect, we don't see a heterogeneous effect, but we do see some interesting kind of digging into that, what you noticed of the what you were talking about the jump. You see, for example, for the anticipated reminder conditional on having a deadline, you actually see a bigger positive point estimate on day 1 and less of a potential jump on day 7 when they actually get the reminder. And on that kind of effect on the early days versus the later days. So I mentioned that if you just pool all of the early days and compare it to all the pooled later days, you do see a statistically significant difference. And so that's what this table is showing here. Obviously, if you compare like day 6 versus day 7, you can see by the confidence intervals, those aren't different. But if for more power, you pool the pre-reminder days, compare them to the post-reminder days, you do see that 1 percentage point increase after the reminder is statistically significant when you do that pooling to get more power. Let me see, is there anything else on GIAs? And then I'll get to the other couple of comments. Whether they paid attention to whether they knew they had the anticipated reminder, of course, that could drive down any potential treatment effects. We do see treatment effects of the anticipated reminder. I think we have a survey question about it that we haven't done the analysis with yet. So we definitely should do that and see what fraction of people tell us they knew that they were going to get the reminder. And I love the idea about micro-founding trust. I think that's definitely a direction we should go, and that's super helpful to get the ideas of how we could do that. And I'll probably bug you later as we start to try to implement that to chat more about it. So yeah, thanks again, Gia. Excellent discussion, super helpful. Michael, on your comment about generalizability. So I think I agree with you. There's two types of trust. I don't think we can separate the two. So there's whether it's outright fraud, and then there's whether it's you trust it's coming from the fintech company, but you don't know whether there are strings attached, whether this is real, whether they're trying to change some other fine print. I don't think we can separate the two. I would call them both types of trust. I do think it's somewhat generalizable in the sense, of course, there's always external validity. Will this apply in another context? You have to do the test in the other context to know. But I think we have seen evidence in some of the firms and development literature. We've seen more anecdotal evidence that trust does matter. So one example is this paper by Isabella Monalici about when multinationals start working. So what's the effect for firms of starting to become a supplier to a multinational? And they did a survey of these multinationals. And one thing the multinational said is, oh, we really have to trust the local suppliers. And that can be trusting that they're actually going to follow through on certain things, be consistent and things like that. And so that was anecdotal evidence from a survey response. I've now collected, we still need to add them as cites in the paper, a few different examples of that, where there was some survey where firms do really talk about the importance of trust in firm-to-firm interactions. But we think this is the first hard evidence we're seeing where we had an intervention where we're actually able to move the needle on trust in a firm-to-firm interaction, and that actually moved the needle on adoption of a profitable opportunity. Poshwan, on the estimated savings, we proposed doing that, and the idea did not fly with our research partner. Part of it was based on complexity, and so yeah, what we can do is that we know from the survey, we ask them both what their current fee is. So this gets at Gia's point about, do they, what's their perception of their current fee? People are mostly accurate. So a lot of people get it exactly right. I think the majority, and then some get it a little bit off, but actually, if anything, if they get it a little bit off, they overestimate their fee. So that's in the direction of thinking it's even more valuable of an offer than it would be. But we could also exploit heterogeneity there. We also ask a question of how much would you save by, I think we ask what their current sales are. And I think we also ask them how much they expect to save. And we haven't done a lot to exploit heterogeneity. We haven't exploited heterogeneity there, but we could certainly do that. But I think doing a treatment where we actually tell them how much we think they would save didn't fly with our research partner. And then Bernard, geographic heterogeneity. That's, yeah, we should definitely do that. There's a lot of reasons that could be super interesting. We know the exact geocoordinates of the firms. We haven't done anything with the geocoordinates yet.
Well, thank you. And Yi Wang told me that somehow you want to say something? Or?
Yes, just one last comment about the location heterogeneity. When we talk about trust, maybe we should rely on something called contract enforcement. So contract enforcement matters across different regions in Mexico, and the different contract enforcement by different groups. So I would like to echo what the panel said, and it's my minor footnotes. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, great suggestion. We can see if there's any kind of geographic variation in contract enforcement that we can exploit. Actually, I'll bug one of my co-authors on another paper who's done some stuff on courts in Mexico, and maybe he has some nice data on geographic variation in contract enforcement that we could use there.
Yeah, thank you. There seems to be a lot of things about the level of economics development and the use of the financial markets, et cetera, affect the level of trust that people generally have. But anyway, I think our time is pretty much up. I want to thank Sean for giving us a very interesting paper, attacking a very important question with the theory and the survey data that allow us to unpack the various forces that delay the adoption of a good thing. I want to thank Jie Bai for giving us a very detailed comment, very helpful comment, very illuminating. I want to thank the participants for raising very good questions. So overall, I also want to thank the audience for listening. This is a wonderful seminar. Thank you very much. On November the 2nd, we are going to have a paper on red tech, and the presenter is going to be Ellen Kwan from Hong Kong, and then it will be discussed by Meo Chang of USC. I look forward to seeing you on November the 2nd. Thank you very much, and so bye-bye. Thank you.